Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 6 must-start players for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about 5 different prospects, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and a tight end going into Week 6 that I believe you should be reconsidering as potential players that can be started this week and could very easily help you win your Week 6 matchups. Of course, throughout today's video, I'll give you guys statistics to justify the reasons as to why I want to start these players going into Week 6 and hopefully give you guys more confidence in doing the same. Now, before we begin talking about these players, I do want to go ahead and remind you, we're going to go over the results of last week's must-start players, the 4 players that I mentioned last week on this similar episode. And then at the end of today's video, after we talk about our must-start players for Week 6, we'll talk about some juicy prize pick entries that you guys should be making this upcoming weekend. Again, if you guys have not yet already, be sure to check out Prize Picks. There's a link down in the description. When you sign up today using promo code Andrew, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So for those of you who are trying to get daily fantasy at your fingertips for this upcoming weekend's games, of course, be sure to check that out. There's a link down in the description. Thank you very much. Also, for those of you who have yet to do so, be sure to subscribe. We are very close to reaching our goal of 70,000 subscribers. Of course, we're not stopping there, and we're making daily fantasy football content in order to help you out. So of course, do yourself a favor, click that subscribe button. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 6 must-starts. But before we do that, let's talk about some of the results of last week. We mentioned 4 players on this episode last week. We mentioned Robert Woods, Tyler Conklin, Devin Duvernay, and Isaiah Pacheco. Now, unfortunately, 3 of those 4 options were complete dud plays. Robert Woods did not show up in a relatively advantageous matchup against the Washington Commanders secondary, while Tyler Conklin completely showed a goose egg with only 1 target, 0 catches against the Miami Dolphins defense. We had Devin Duvernay had himself the only good week out of the bunch of players, of course, due to the fact that we saw Rashad Bateman out in Week 5. And then we had Isaiah Pacheco, who in my opinion was a guy that I mentioned multiple times, hey, do not start him. This is just me trying to flex my mind and see if I can actually predict this kind of an insane play. Obviously, he didn't do anything as that matchup went into the favor of the Las Vegas Raiders early on. There wasn't a lead in the second half of that game, so they weren't able to bleed the clock with Isaiah Pacheco and his running ability. Nonetheless, it is what it is. When we go ahead and we total my current record thus far this season on players that have currently been in that range on Yahoo of being started in 30% or less leagues, thus far I'm 12, 13, and 1. Not bad. We'll take it. As of right now, we're trying to get better every single week. There are going to be weeks where I'm awful like this, and there's going to be weeks where I'm fantastic. That's just the nature of the beast. We're going to continue on. So let's go ahead and let's go forward to Week 6. Beginning with our number 1, we have Eno Benjamin. Now, the reason why, of course, I want to play Eno Benjamin is because all signs are pointing towards James Conner and Darrell Williams both being out this upcoming week. The only other running back that will be active this upcoming weekend for the Arizona Cardinals is Ingram, the rookie running back out of USC. So Eno Benjamin is expected to get all the work as he's the veteran in this backfield. And similar to last week, having scored a touchdown, we're expecting him to find the end zone and be a fantastic fantasy option for many of our teams going into Week 6. Of course, the matchup that he takes on is against the division rival, the Seattle Seahawks. As we have seen over the course of the last 3 weeks, the Seattle Seahawks have not been able to stop anybody defensively. Whether it is on the ground, through the air, to wide receivers, to tight ends, to running backs, it does not matter. They have given up a boatload of fantasy points. Even going back to last week, Alvin Kamara, 103 rushing yards on the ground, of course, had 91 receiving yards on 6 receptions, while also Taysom Hill had 9 carries for 112 rushing yards against that defense, 3 rushing touchdowns. There was a lot of potential to be had against this defense, and it wasn't just those 2 performances that have convinced me to, of course, must start Eno Benjamin going into the week. It's also the fact that a week prior to that, against the Detroit Lions, Jamal Williams had himself 108 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, while the week before even that, Cordero Patterson against the Seattle Seahawks defense went for 141 rushing yards. They've given up 4 100-yard rushers in just the last 3 weeks alone. Obviously, they're going to try to fix that. I don't think they'll be able to. Eno Benjamin is a fantastic play this week and a must start in my mind. Moving on, let's talk about Darrell Henderson, the thumbnail for today's video. As of, just a couple moments ago prior to this video's recording, I was given information that Darrell Henderson will be the starting running back as Cam Akers is dealing with a personal issue and they're keeping that in-house. They haven't designated what it is, and he's not going to be playing against the Carolina Panthers. Now, of course, like we all know, the Carolina Panthers, they're giving up the 6th most points to opposing running backs thus far this season in terms of rushing statistics only. So rushing yardage and rushing touchdown. As of thus far this season, they have given up 601 rushing yards on 125 carries, which is a 4.81 yard per carry average against opposing running backs. They've given up 4 rushing touchdowns in the first 5 games, which is about 16.82 fantasy points per game just off rushing statistics alone. Fantastic. Now, again, if you go ahead and look at last week's performance from the San Francisco 49ers running attack, Jeff Wilson Jr., 17 carries, 120 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown, while also Tevin Coleman in the second half of that game found a lot of success. 8 carries, 23 yards, obviously relatively inefficient, but scored himself a rushing touchdown while he was also able to get himself 3 targets, 3 catches, 44 yards, and a receiving touchdown. So 3 touchdowns out of the 49ers running backs last week against this Carolina Panthers defense. I think there's a lot of upside for Darrell Henderson, who's currently only being started in 14% of leagues as of this recording, to be a player that should absolutely be in your lineup going into this upcoming weekend. Now, for many of our situations, he may be available on the waivers. If he is a must pick up and play this upcoming weekend for those of you who are interested in a back. Again, we have a couple players that are on bye week, of course, Derrick Henry, Dameon Pierce, Josh Jacobs, Jamal Williams / DeAndre Swift. If you don't have those guys available, this could easily be a plug and play that has a lot of high upside. If you guys remember, earlier this season, week 1, when Darrell Henderson was the primary back of this team, 13 rushing attempts, 5 targets that led to 5 receptions. That level of opportunity is fantastic. Not only that, if we go back to weeks 1 through 8 of the 2021 season, when Darrell Henderson was the starting running back of this team, he was averaging 16.4 half PPR fantasy points per game. There's a lot of potential for Darrell Henderson, and that's absolutely why he's a must-start going into the week. Moving on to George Pickens, the next player I wanted to mention, the first wide receiver for today's list. As of right now, George Pickens is in a perfect scenario for a, garbage time spree of points. That's what I'm purely expecting, because that's purely what we've seen over the last couple weeks here. You go back to week 4, as soon as Kenny Pickett was given the starting job over Mitch Trubisky, midway through that game, he came in, he targeted George Pickens 4 times. That led to 4 receptions and 71 receiving yards. You follow that up with the next week against the Buffalo Bills secondary. Obviously, it's still difficult because they're well coached over there, even though they didn't have their primary starters. 8 targets that led to 6 receptions, 83 receiving yards. So overall, pretty good work. 12 targets, 10 catches, over 150 receiving yards in just the last 2 weeks alone. Now we get into a scenario where they're taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary. And I absolutely believe that this is going to be a blowout in the favor of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in regards to potential PrizePicks entries that you can make later this week, as the entire, Pittsburgh Steelers secondary is going to be out. Their starters are all gone. We'll talk about that at more of an extent as to how we want to approach that for, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. But as of right now, let's look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary. The expectation is Jamel Dean is going to be covering Deontay Johnson. While we know that Chase Claypool is going to be the slot receiver, so he'll get the nickel corner that's going to guard him for majority of that game. While on the other side of the field, by himself, George Pickens probably won't pull any double coverage, and he'll be going up against Carlton Davis. Davis, thus far this season, has been targeted the second most times amongst all cornerbacks in the entire National Football League. Teams want to go after him, and they continue to do so every single week. He's been targeted 42 times. Of those 42 targets, he's given up the 6th most receptions amongst the quarterback position. He's given up 25 receptions thus far this season. That has led to the 3rd most receiving yards allowed by a cornerback, 353, and the 8th most receiving touchdowns by a cornerback, which is 2 thus far this season. Carlton Davis is a perfect matchup for George Pickens. He's a ascending star within this offense, and considering we do expect to see Kenny Pickett throwing for the entirety of this second half, I'm expecting George Pickens to have a lot of value this upcoming week. Moving on, let's talk about Devin Duvernay. We're bringing him back into the fold, mainly because I thought he was going to be a 1-week guy and we can move on, but ultimately Rashad Bateman looks like he is not going to be playing once again this week in week 6. And that does present a lot of value for Devin Duvernay. Thus far this season, he's put up 19.4, 11.2, 9.3, 7.1, 10.3 fantasy points. Those are his 5-week combinations for a half PPR scoring format. Now, if in fact we're going to continue to see him play more and more of the offensive snaps, as last week he had a season-high 72% snaps played, not only was he given an ample amount of targets going in his direction, which led to 5 receptions, 54 receiving yards, he was given 3 rushing attempts out of the backfield. This is kind of the way that the Atlanta Falcons initially began using Cordarrelle Patterson out of the backfield, in the sense that Cordarrelle Patterson is a very successful return, specialist. And that's exactly what Devin Duvernay is. He's a return specialist, and he knows how to read blocks and, get yardage from him. If we're going to continue to see Devin Duvernay not only get passing opportunities, but also rushing attempts, his value continues to rise, in my opinion, only being started in 30% of leagues right now. This is a fantastic opportunity for you to go ahead, start him once again this week. Last week, he had 2 passing attempts that were thrown 5 yards over his head, both of them about 50 yards down the field. If one of those connect, which they very easily can, going up against the New York Giants defense, I think there's a very high upside week in Devin Duvernay's final box score for week 6. All right, moving on to the final player I wanted to mention. It is a tight end by the name of Taysom Hill. Yes, I am pretty much, I've drank the Kool-Aid. It's at that point, and I think many of us have. The fact that we are once again going to see Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry out again, this absolutely presents pure opportunity for Taysom Hill. Because when we have seen both those wide receivers out, they have leaned in the direction of Taysom Hill. In week 4, let's think about this. Minnesota, there was no Jarvis Landry, there was no Michael Thomas. Guess what happened? 5 rushing attempts went towards Taysom Hill. That led to 21 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. Then you go to week 5 against the Seattle Seahawks. Of course, you didn't have either of those 2 wide receivers available. And we also saw Chris Olave go down with a concussion. So without many receiving threats available to make plays down the field, they have to continue to lean upon the running game, which they're so good at right now. Even with Alvin Kamara back there, they were able to run the ball 9 times with Taysom Hill for 112 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, and he even had a passing touchdown. Whether it is on the ground, through the air via the passing game, or even the receiving game, don't be surprised if he catches a couple balls any given week now. There's a lot of potential to be had. For those of us who are potentially missing the services of, Hawkinson, Waller, Freiermuth this upcoming week, maybe you had, Conklin as your starting tight end, and you just don't trust it. Maybe you don't want to trust Kyle Pitts again this upcoming week against the 49ers, who have had a storied history of being fantastic against opposing tight ends. I think Taysom Hill presents an opportunity here to be a must-start option as someone that I'm absolutely fully on board with and starting as a top 10 potential tight end prospect in this given week. All right, now that we've covered our week 6 must-start players, I'm going to go ahead and transition to talking about some prize pick entries that we can all make. Again, I got some juicy ones, so hear me out. Here we go. All right, so as you can see to the right of me, we are here via PrizePicks. Again, if you guys haven't yet already and you want to go ahead and participate in some daily fantasy contests for this upcoming weekend, you can sign up today using promo code ANDREW down in the description of the video. If you click on the link, use the promo code and make a first-time deposit. You'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So if you deposit 20, you'll be given 20. If you deposit 50, you'll be given 50 up until 100. So for those of you who aren't interested, be sure to take advantage of that. All right, so I've got a couple plays here that I am really confident about. Obviously, the last couple of days, I haven't been as successful. Yesterday, I was suggesting Carson Wentz in terms of going more on his passing yard total. Obviously, that did not work. He didn't even go over 100 passing yards in that given game. And there's been a couple players that I've been pretty excited about going after in terms of putting together some potential entries. Now, like I mentioned a little bit ago in regards to George Pickens, information has been, displayed to the public that the starting 2 cornerbacks and Minkah Fitzpatrick, all for the Pittsburgh Steelers, are going to be out this upcoming week. So if, in fact, we're in a scenario where we're looking for Mike Evans, for example, let's look up Mike Evans. Mike Evans right now has a number of 63 receiving yards against the Pittsburgh Steelers that do not have starting secondary members. We'll go ahead and take that. We're going to take the more on that option. Let's go ahead. Let's see what they're dealing with Chris Godwin this week. He's got himself a number of 62.5 receiving yards. Again, both these numbers I think are very much so achievable. As of late, obviously we haven't seen Chris Godwin be able to total these numbers at a consistent level. But to be honest, I think we're in a position here that he could very easily surpass this number as his snap count continues to go up. But for right now, considering I do trust Mike Evans just slightly more, we're just going to keep Mike Evans in this position. You know what's hilarious? Look at this. I'm not even joking. The number literally just went up. As mid-recording, this number just went from, 63.5 to 67. I'm so comfortable with that. But imagine, you see, the number is going up for a reason, guys. It's not by accident. It's because these numbers are going to be extremely achievable by these receiving options, because now PrizePicks is getting word that there's going to be a potential where those starting corners are going to be out, which pretty much has been confirmed. Either way, a couple of the other players that I wanted to go after. I saw that there was a number for rushing attempts. This is pretty exciting, right? You can go after sacks, interceptions, fantasy points scored, touchdowns, but rushing attempts really did catch my eye a little bit earlier in regards to Breece Hall. Breece Hall, his number is currently 12.5. I'm going on the more. Quite easily is that a automatic play in my mind. Now, when you've gone ahead and looked at what Breece Hall has done as of late, thus far this season, he's been able to put up a total of 17 and 18 rushing attempts in each of the last 2 weeks, while Michael Carter, who's been given his fair share of rushing attempts, has only averaged 1.89 yards per carry in the last 2 games. If we're going to be in a scenario where Michael Carter is going to get less rushing attempts, they're going to begin to pivot that in the direction of Breece Hall, who has been averaging 4.66 yards per carry in each of the last 2 games, I think we're in a fantastic position to see him find a successful week and, of course, run the ball 13 or more times this upcoming week. If you go ahead and put this in perspective, in the last 5 weeks alone, we have seen the Green Bay Packers have running backs run on them 19 times, 32 times, 12 times, 19 times, 28 times. The only time that this number has not been achieved was when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers took on the Green Bay Packers and Leonard Fournette was the only running back to get any rushing attempts. This is a number that is an absolute smash in my opinion. I will take Breece Hall here. Now, a couple of the other statistics that I saw up here was in regards to interceptions. We have seen both Matt Ryan and Matthew Stafford throw an interception in 4 out of the last 5 games. So if we're going to be, real with ourselves, one of these two guys is going to throw an interception. If any of them is going to do it, I'm probably leaning towards the idea that it is going to be Matthew Stafford because, he led the league last season in interceptions. It doesn't, really, in my opinion, seem like he's slowing down in that regard. This is a little bit of a riskier play because, again, an interception is tough to potentially predict. But the fact that, again, like I mentioned, he was able to literally, as you can see on screen, surpass this number in 4 out of the last 5 games. I'm relatively confident in that idea. So we're going to go ahead. We're going to add him to this. We're going to go more on his number. We're going to scroll back up. Okay, a couple more players I wanted to mention. In regards to fantasy points scored, I believe there was a couple players here that I actually really like their numbers. If I scroll on down here, let's see here. There's a lot of players to kind of filter through. Taysom Hill. We talked about him as a must-start option. His current fantasy point total, more or less, is 3 fantasy points. Guys, 30 rushing yards, if he falls into the end zone, it's over. But 30 rushing yards, y'all think he can't do that? I think he's very easily capable of accomplishing that this upcoming week, especially considering all that is, currently with this situation. So I'm taking the more on that number. Now, there are other players that I'd like to go ahead and add to a potential entry this upcoming week, but let's go ahead and let's take this, okay? As of right now, with 1, 2, 3, 4 players, we could potentially 10 times our overall entry. So we're going to go ahead and do exactly that right now. All right, now that we've made that entry and we're back at the board, I do want to also talk about other players in terms of their total fantasy points scored. Let's go ahead and scroll down. Where is my man, Ramondre Stevenson? Ramondre Stevenson's currently at 16 fantasy points. So we just need him to get more than 16 fantasy points in a full PPR scoring format, and it's a done deal. And let's be honest, 16 fantasy points is not a lot when what we're expecting from him is going to be more like 20 this week. Let's think about this. Earlier this season, week 3 against the Baltimore Ravens, he had 20.1 fantasy points. Week 5 against the Detroit Lions, had 19.5 fantasy points. Last season against the Cleveland Browns, again, that's a team that he plays against this week, he had 27.4 full PPR fantasy points. Let's look at the Cleveland Browns defense as a whole over the last 3 weeks. If you go back to the Chargers game last week, 27 rushing attempts for 222 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns from these running backs. That also led to 6 targets, 6 catches, 59 yards, and a receiving touchdown from Eckler and the combination of Kelly out of the Chargers backfield. You go back to the week prior to that. Okay, let's look at the Falcons matchup. The Falcons ran the ball 30 times for 199 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 1 catch on 1 target, 20 receiving yards. Pretty easy there. Even the Pittsburgh Steelers, even Najee Harris was able to have himself a plus 10 fantasy point game against them. And that was the last time we saw that. They had themselves 19 rushing attempts for 86 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 8 receiving yards. A lot of potential here. I'm going to go ahead, play them more on this. There's another player that I wanted to mention in terms of fantasy points. Let me go ahead and scroll down and let me see if he's available here. Another player that I'm super excited about. Maybe he's going to be way lower on this list depending on what team I'm looking for. Where are you? Zach Ertz. Boom. Zach Ertz, 11 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. That's pretty much 6 receptions, 50 yards, or the opposite, 5 receptions, 60 yards. But let's think about this. Zach Ertz in the last 5 weeks has put up 11.4, 15.5, 10.5, 16.7, and 10.8. So in 2 out of those last 5 weeks, he's not been able to accomplish this number. But luckily for him, he takes on the Seattle Seahawks. Last season, when he took on the Seahawks with the Arizona Cardinals, he put up 28.8 points in one game and 15.4 in the other in a full PPR scoring format. So if, in fact, we're looking at it in the sense of, hey, this matchup is advantageous. We've recently seen the Saints tight ends, specifically receiving tight ends, catch the ball 3 times for 45 yards and a touchdown against this defense. While the week prior to that, TJ Hawkinson, 8 catches, 179 and 2 touchdowns. And even before that, the Falcons, 6 catches, 99 yards. That was the best week that Kyle Pitts has had this season already. There's a lot of potential to be had here. I'm very easily thinking this is a more number that we want to go after and potentially put an entry on. I'm feeling so confident on this one that I'm willing to go ahead, make a $20 entry. So for those of you who are interested in potentially following on these overall entries or potentially fading and going with your own entries, there's a lot to be had here via daily fantasy at PrizePicks. So for those of you who are interested, go ahead, sign up today using promo code Andrew. When you do so, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. There's a link down in the description. Again, when you sign up using that promo code, it definitely helps out this channel, keeps the bright lights on. Again, I just look towards the light and I'm blind, but either way, we're going to go ahead and place this entry. All right, for today, that's going to cover all of the entries we want to put in. Again, tomorrow we'll be live streaming here on the channel from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Of course, we'll be putting together some entries for those of you who are interested. Of course, I got to do a little bit more research on some of these numbers, kind of tightening up on them. Either way, I appreciate you guys watching today's video. If you haven't yet already, subscribe, click the like button down below, and let me know down in the comment section what players are you potentially starting this upcoming week, even though they aren't considered major options. Is it a Randall Cobb? Is it a Darius Slayton? Is it Tyler Boyd? Are we risking it on T. Higgins? Let me know down in the comment section. I appreciate you all. Tomorrow, we'll be live streaming Sunday morning like we typically do every Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kickoff with Kirchhoff. We'll have updated rankings at all primary positions, running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defense, all up to date as of Sunday morning to help you guys out. Until next time, guys, I'll see you. Peace.